There's a report circulating right now that Kathleen Kennedy is preparing to retire from Lucasfilm, and what's striking isn't the headline itself, but the reaction to it. Slashfilm picked up the story, citing Puck News and Matthew Bologna, and under almost any other circumstances in the last decade, this would have been the kind of announcement that sent shockwaves through the Star Wars fandom. There was a time when people would have treated this as a seismic event, a moment of vindication, a turning point that would supposedly, quote-unquote, fix everything. But today, the reaction is something far more revealing than celebration or outrage. It's indifference. It's a shrug. It's the sound of a fandom that has been worn down to the point where even the departure of the most polarizing figure in modern Star Wars history barely registers. That silence says more about the state of Star Wars than any headline ever could. It tells you that the emotional investment that once defined this franchise has evaporated. It tells you that the audience no longer believes that leadership changes will affect the trajectory of a brand that has been drifting for years. And it tells you that the magic, the anticipation, the sense of cultural weight that Star Wars used to command has been replaced by something much more fragile. Apathy. Not anger, not disappointment, just a quiet, exhausted sense of, why should I care? And the truth is, this apathy didn't appear out of nowhere. It was built slowly, brick by brick, through a decade of decisions that chipped away at the audience's trust. One of the clearest examples of this erosion is the endless cycle of movie announcements that never go anywhere. It's almost surreal to look back at the list of projects Lucasfilm has unveiled with great fanfare, only for them to fade into silence. Rian Johnson's trilogy was supposed to redefine the franchise. Patty Jenkins' Rogue Squadron was announced with a dramatic video of her rollerblading across a runway in a flight suit. There was the Rey movie, James Mangold's biblical-era Star Wars film, Taika Waititi's mysterious project, Kevin Feige's Star Wars movie that was supposedly a done deal, the Benioff and Weiss trilogy, the guys behind Game of Thrones. Each one arrived with excitement, speculation, and promises of a bold new direction, and each one quietly disappeared without a single official cancellation. This is how you train an audience to stop believing you. This is how you create a culture of skepticism where every new announcement is met with the same tired refrain. I'll believe it when I see it. That's not cynicism, that's the natural consequence of being told over and over again that something big is coming, only for nothing to materialize. When you announce 10 movies and deliver none, the 11th announcement becomes meaningless, it becomes noise, and eventually the audience stops listening altogether. You can see the fallout from this pattern in the way Lucasfilm handled Star Wars Starfighter, the Ryan Gosling film set for 2027. The marketing strategy wasn't about building hype or teasing the story, it was about proving the movie actually existed. They made a point of announcing when filming began, they made a point of announcing when filming wrapped, they released behind-the-scenes photos not to excite the audience, but to reassure them. The message wasn't get ready for something new, the message was, we promise this one is real. That's how far the trust has fallen, and even with all that effort, the question still lingers. Will anyone care by the time 2027 arrives? Will the audience still have the emotional bandwidth for a new Star Wars movie after a decade of false starts, creative drift, and brand fatigue? The same erosion of trust shows up in the handling of The Mandalorian. If the series had ended after Season 2, it would have gone out on a high note. The emotional climax of Grogu leaving with Luke Skywalker was powerful, resonant, and final in the best way. It felt like the natural conclusion to a story that had captured the audience's imagination. But instead of letting that moment breathe, Lucasfilm immediately undercut it by turning the Book of Boba Fett into The Mandalorian Season 2.5. The emotional payoff was reversed almost instantly. The story that felt complete was reopened for business. And now, with the Mandalorian and Grogu movie on the horizon, the question becomes, how do you justify this story continuing after the Season 2 finale? How do you make that emotional moment matter when the franchise itself treated it as temporary? The answer is simple. You don't. You stop trying to force everything into a single continuity. You stop treating canon like a straitjacket. You let the movie be non-canonical to the series the same way anime treat its theatrical films for decades. Naruto had 3 movies released alongside the anime: Ninja Clash in the Land of Snow, Legend of the Stone of Gelel, and Guardians of the Crescent Moon Kingdom. None of them were canonical. None of them needed to be. They were fun, self-contained adventures featuring characters the audience loved. You could jump into any of them cold and be fine. In fact, that's exactly how I discovered Naruto. Toonami aired Guardians of the Crescent Moon Kingdom, and that was my entry point. I watched the movie, enjoyed it, and then went back to the beginning of the anime. The movie didn't need to fit into the canon, it just needed to be good. That's the mindset Lucasfilm should have adopted for The Mandalorian and Grogu. Let it be a standalone adventure with two beloved characters. Let it be fun, let it breathe, because the alternative is another story that feels like homework. Another chapter in a franchise that has forgotten how to surprise its audience. And that brings me to a principle that gets drilled into your head from day one in art school, okay? Less is more. It's a cliche because it's true. And it's a lesson Star Wars desperately needs to relearn. The franchise has been drowning in content for over a decade, and the results speak for themselves. Look at Andor. It was one of the most critically acclaimed Star Wars projects ever made. Tony Gilroy expected the audience to embrace the show and for critics to be the ones he had to win over. Instead, the opposite happened. Critics loved it immediately, but the audience didn't show up. IndieWire even pointed to Disney's mismanagement of the brand as a major factor in the show's low viewership. The problem wasn't the quality of Andor. The problem was that the audience was exhausted. And that exhaustion becomes even more obvious when you look at Skeleton Crew. It was praised by critics and audiences alike, embraced by people who argue that if George Lucas himself returned to make another Star Wars project, this is the kind of story he would tell. It had heart, imagination, and a sense of wonder that felt closer to the original spirit of the franchise than anything Disney had produced in years. And yet, despite all of that, Skeleton Crew pulled in lower viewership than The Acolyte, a show that became one of the most divisive entries in the franchise's history. That contrast isn't about quality, it's about the audience being overwhelmed. When you release something Star Wars every single year, sometimes multiple times a year, you train people to treat the franchise like background noise. You turn something that used to be an event into something that feels like homework. This is the inevitable result of a release strategy that has been running non-stop since 2014. Now, if you want to be technical, you can extend that back to 2008 with the Clone Wars on Cartoon Network. But the real shift began once Disney took over. From Rebels to The Force Awakens, from Rogue One to The Last Jedi, from Solo to The Rise of Skywalker, from The Mandalorian to Book of Boba Fett, Obi-Wan Kenobi to Ahsoka, so on and so forth. The franchise has been in a constant state of output. There has been no rest, no pause, no moment to breathe. And while that kind of relentless production schedule works for someone like Roger Corman, whose films were made quickly, cheaply, and with the understanding that not every project needed to be a masterpiece, it does not work for a cultural monolith like Star Wars. Corman could reuse props, sets, music, and even entire shots because his films were designed to be disposable entertainment. Star Wars, on the other hand, was built on myth. It was built on the idea that each new chapter mattered. You cannot maintain that sense of importance when you're releasing content at the pace of a streaming service trying to fill a calendar. And this oversaturation becomes even more glaring when you remember that Star Wars already had a complete saga. Episodes 1 through 6 told a full story, a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's why the prequel trilogy is being quote-unquote rediscovered today. Those movies were always good. They were ambitious, thematically rich, visually inventive, and emotionally sincere. The problem was never the films themselves. The problem was a small, loud minority of the fandom that hijacked the conversation online and convinced everyone that prequels bad, originals good was the only acceptable opinion. Red Letter Media's videos became gospel. That was Mr. Plinkett. Early Chris Stuckman and early Jeremy Johns built their brands on dunking on the prequels. And most people were too afraid to push back because the internet had decided that hating the prequels was the cool thing to do. In a way, we as Star Wars fans deserve what the franchise became under Disney's stewardship, because we allowed that vocal minority to dominate the discourse for so fucking long. We let them define what Star Wars was supposed to be. We let them shame anyone who enjoyed something different. And when Disney stepped in, they didn't challenge that narrative. They embraced it. They built the sequel trilogy around the idea that nostalgia was the only thing the audience wanted. They treated the original trilogy as the only era that mattered. And the result was a trilogy that felt like a corporate product rather than a creative vision. You can see this most clearly in The Force Awakens. It's a film that was designed to be familiar, designed to be safe, designed to evoke the emotional beats of A New Hope without challenging the audience or expanding the mythology in any meaningful way. And the irony is that this approach created a movie that people enjoyed in the moment, but never formed a lasting emotional connection to. I recently made a video about why no one has nostalgia for The Force Awakens after 10 years, and someone left a comment that summed it up perfectly. You can't have nostalgia for something that required nostalgia to enjoy. That's the core problem. The movie didn't create new memories, it borrowed old ones. It didn't build its own identity, it leaned on the identity of something that already existed. And because of that, it never became a cultural touchstone in its own right. This is why Kathleen Kennedy's retirement doesn't matter in the way it once would have. The issue isn't one executive, the issue is the system. The issue is the release strategy. The issue is the endless announcements that never go anywhere. The issue is the lack of cultural specificity, the lack of creative risk, the lack of patience. The issue is a franchise that refuses to rest. A franchise that refuses to let anticipation build. A franchise that refuses to let absence create value. The apathy surrounding Kennedy's departure isn't a sign that people don't care about leadership. It's a sign that people don't believe leadership changes will fix anything. It's a sign that the audience has emotionally checked out. And that brings me to the conclusion I've been circling around this entire time. The only way to save Star Wars is for it to completely go away. Not for a year, not for a brief hiatus, I mean gone. 10 to 15 years of absolute silence. No movies, no shows, no announcements, no "we're developing something exciting" press releases, nothing. Because people forget what real anticipation feels like. They forget what it was like in 1999 when The Phantom Menace arrived 16 years after Return of the Jedi. That wasn't just a movie release, it was a cultural event. It was the return of something people thought they might never see again. And when The Phantom Menace crossed $1 billion, that meant something. In the entire 1990s, only 3 films hit that milestone: Jurassic Park, Titanic, and The Phantom Menace. That was the whole list. And Jurassic Park was the first movie in history to cross $1 billion unadjusted for inflation, of course. $1 billion wasn't a marketing bullet point, it was a cultural earthquake. Even The Force Awakens had that same gravitational pull. 10 years had passed since Revenge of the Sith, a full decade. And no one counts the 2008 Clone Wars theatrical release. It was just 4 TV episodes stitched together to launch a series. It wasn't a Star Wars movie in the cultural sense. So when The Force Awakens arrived, it felt like the return of a myth. It felt like Star Wars coming home. And that's why the excitement surrounding The Phantom Menace and The Force Awakens felt so enormous. It wasn't just about the films themselves. It was about the long stretch of silence that came before them. That silence created space. It created longing. It created the sense that Star Wars was returning from myth rather than routine. You can't replicate that feeling when the franchise never steps out of the spotlight long enough for anyone to miss it. That's the real problem Star Wars faces today. Not a lack of talent, not a lack of ideas, not even a lack of leadership. It's the absence of absence. The franchise has been running at full volume for so long that the emotional frequency it once operated on has flattened. Everything feels the same size. Everything feels like content. And when everything is content, nothing feels like an event. This is why Kathleen Kennedy's retirement lands with a thud instead of a shockwave. It's not that people don't care about the future of Star Wars. It's that they no longer believe any single change can restore what's been lost. The fatigue is deeper than one executive. It's structural, it's cultural, it's the result of a decade spent treating Star Wars like a pipeline instead of a myth. And that's why the only meaningful path forward is the one option Disney has never seriously considered: letting Star Wars go quiet. Not for a season, not for a production cycle, for years. Long enough for the noise to fade, long enough for the brand to stop feeling like homework, long enough for a generation to grow up without new Star Wars shaping their media diet. Because that's how you rebuild mystique. That's how you restore scale. That's how you make the galaxy far, far away feel far away again. If Star Wars disappeared for a decade, its return would matter. Not because of nostalgia alone, but because the silence would give the franchise back the one thing it has completely lost: weight. The sense that a new Star Wars story is something worth gathering around, something worth anticipating, something worth arguing about, celebrating, or even rejecting. Silence creates stakes. Silence creates hunger. Silence creates meaning. Right now, Star Wars has none of those things. It has output, it has volume, it has announcements, but it doesn't have weight. And weight is what made Star Wars Star Wars. So yes, Kathleen Kennedy stepping down is a headline, but it's not a turning point. The turning point will only come when Lucasfilm, whoever is running it, understands that the most powerful creative decision they can make is restraint. Not expansion, not acceleration, restraint. Let Star Wars rest. Let it vanish. Let the galaxy go dark for a while. Because when it finally returns, if we're being fair, the silence behind it will do more for the franchise than any trilogy announcement ever could. Sometimes the only way to save something is to stop touching it. Sometimes the only way to make people care again is to give them the chance to miss it. And Star Wars has never needed that chance more than it does right now.